I'm just going to give everyone about one more minute to kind of join and make sure we have everyone, and then I'll introduce our speaker for today. More will join as we're going, but I'm happy to introduce Kim Pesaturo, who is the Assistant Dean of Assessment and Accreditation at Western New England University. She received her PharmD from the University of Rhode Island and did her PGY1 residency at St. Joseph's Healthcare in Kentucky and her PGY2 pediatric specialty residency at the University of Kentucky, UK Healthcare. Her interests include innovation in teaching methods and faculty development. And we're super excited to have her here today to talk about providing difficult feedback to students. So, Kim, I know we're short on time with only 30 minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Heather. So, hello, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, depending on where you are located currently. I am so excited to be here today. I love this topic. I've been precepting students since 2005, and I've recently, about 2 years ago, moved more into the assessment realm, and with assessment comes feedback. So this is something that has been a part of my life, a part of my job for quite some time. So today's presentation is called 19 Words, Providing Difficult Feedback to Students. And if you're not familiar with the concept of 19 words, we'll get to that as we go through. It'll be a brief presentation, approximately 20 or so slides. And by the end of today, we'll touch on some of the current concepts around who today's learner is or who those learners are. I think that's really important to reflect on before we move into this topic. We'll discuss some relationship between professionalism and professional identity formation and how that feeds into providing effective feedback. And we'll talk about some approaches, and we'll practice with a few case scenarios that I'm actually going to hopefully tap into you about. So if we go through this presentation, I want you to be thinking about conversations you've had with students, with residents, with learners in general. It could even be peers, and conversations that have been difficult. So how are you providing that difficult feedback? So I have nothing to disclose. So we'll start with who are today's learners. You know, it's important to talk about this before we even get into how to provide effective feedback, because one of the key components to effective feedback is knowing who we are and knowing who we're talking to. And so when we're thinking about today's current students, we're mostly talking about Generation Z learners. These are students and residents that are born after 1996. They grew up in times of socioeconomic uncertainty and complexity. So the market crash of 2008, they saw parents go through it. They felt or feel unsettled about the state of the world. They've seen wars, they've seen, elections, things that have really unsettled them. They have been educated in diverse and inclusive settings that are highly promoting inclusivity, diversity, and equity. They have very involved parents typically, and we kind of coin this phrase helicopter parents, but really what we're seeing are overly attentive parents that have raised these students in this generation, and parents that can sometimes be fearful of letting their students go out into the world. Uh, our students now are internet savvy, um, but they're also internet reliant. We call them our digital natives. They have never known a world without Google or without smartphones. My 15-year-old asked me one time if I was born when things were black and white. And I was like, well, no, we still had color back when I was born, but we did not have smartphones or Google. And these students and these learners are attached to meaningful work, income, and job security, likely due to all these instabilities that we've talked about and we've seen them grow up through. Now, in patient care fields, we're seeing them come up as intrinsically motivated. So as opposed to what we have, and this is very much a generalization, but as we've looked at past generations where title holds some prestige, right? They may want the doctoral title. Now we're seeing that the rationale for going to healthcare fields is due to much more of an intrinsic motivation to help others. So these students are altruistic, they're high performers, they're very career-minded, they're goal-oriented, they are performing and growing in places that celebrate teamwork, and they're activists. They're highly motivated in their settings of interest. And so we're working with students. I think we always feel, everybody seems to feel like the generations that come after us are different than the generation we grew up with. And that may be true, but we need to keep in mind that this generation is a very dynamic educated, strong generation of learners. And they have three basic needs. If you've seen me present on this topic before, I've touched on this. And those three basic needs that they require from us or from a workplace setting are autonomy. So they need to feel like they can be on their own and be successful on their own. They need to feel competent in doing their job. And they need this sense of relatedness, which in my opinion, based as a pediatric practitioner, I equate this relatedness to needing a parental figure in the job role, in the school role, on rotation. And sometimes it can feel that way as preceptors and as educators, we're sort of, having a role in parenting these students. And I think that is a normal feeling based on what this generation seems to need. And so we're communicating differently with these learners than we've likely been raised. And how can we support these needs? We can do things like provide items that really enhance their curiosity, provide choice. And choice does not have to be significant. It can be, do you want to start this conversation now or at 3 o'clock? Would you rather look at this patient or this patient? So it can be limited choice, but choice still works. Using non-pressuring language, the way we've learned to write SOAP notes or document in the medical record is sort of how I advocate for approaching our students of today. I want to encourage you to consider this XYZ, that type of language when you're giving feedback. Identify value in what's going on, listen openly, non-judgmental. We need to provide clear direction with detail that's going to help with that autonomy and competence. Give hints where they're needed. One of the biggest non-starters I've seen is the inability to know where to start, right? So if you have a student or a resident where you're like, they're just not doing the work, oftentimes that can be traced back to they don't have enough detail in the assignment to be able to start. They don't know where that starting point is. So detail is so important. They want to see where things are headed. That's this roadmap, right? How is it going to affect the outcome? Silly things, greet them, say goodbye, smile, address them by name. They want to feel like they are an equal member of the team. And I think that's a very valid point. And then praise and thank them as well. We know that today's learners require intellectual challenge. So some of the ways we can do that, practice our high demand teaching. This is where we're going to swim around the right answer. So we want to ask a question that may have multiple answers or components, and we're going to, okay, well, if the scenario changed just slightly, how might that change your answer? We're going to phrase questions in that way and also explore the thought process behind how the student arrived at the answer and work on that. And that's principles surrounding high demand teaching. We use goal setting all the time. And goal setting to me it's interesting because I think we all kind of come into teach, or at least for me, I came into teaching thinking everybody knows how to state a goal or set a goal. Well, goal setting is not something you're born with. It's not an inherent capability, right? And so we have to teach our learners how to set appropriate goals, how to monitor them, how to know when you've met a goal, how to level up that goal. So this is a skill we have to pass along. We want to be able to also promote their self-evaluation. And so we do that by maximizing autonomy and maximizing the type of responsibility we can give that student, as I've shown you in previous slides. We want to incorporate public-facing activities. So really encourage the student to be outside of their comfort zone, public speaking, activism, education, however we can do that, engagement with the medical team. And then encouraging a growth mindset. I'm such a huge believer in this. If you're not familiar with the literature, Carol Dweck is a psychologist. She was at Stanford University for her career. She basically says that we can learn more, do more, be more through hard work. That, if you are willing to put in the time and the effort, your possibilities are endless. And I love that mindset. She says that people develop intelligence through effort, through strategy, and through help from others. And that's exactly why we're here. And that growth mindset is in opposition to a fixed mindset, right? We're saying, okay, well, I got to see on this exam. That's the best I can do, right? That is a very fixed mindset. So we want to encourage the opposite and encourage that growth. And then finally, we need to be comfortable experimenting in the technology realm. I think this is hard for people that didn't grow up as digital natives. This is hard for me. Challenge our students' natural skills, leverage what they know, leverage their ability. I have been working here at Western New England University on AI guidelines in the classroom. And it's really interesting because the initial approach to AI here at Western New England was, well, we just don't want it, right? So we're going to put guardrails on it. If you're going to use it, you have to cite it, you have to do this, but really we don't want it. And then I attended a talk on, it was a national assessment talk a couple months ago. And the messaging there was, if you're not already using AI in your day-to-day, you're behind. And so we want to encourage, our students' ability to grow with what they have in front of them. We also know that today's learners have a high sense of coherence, and coherence is this widely recognized measure of an individual's response to stress. And it measures the extent that someone is likely to see an event as meaningful in their life and worth overcoming. And so we're all going to face roadblocks. That's the whole point of this. We're going to have to provide feedback to students in difficult times. That means that student hit a difficulty in their work. But recognize that today's learners see events as meaningful in their own lives, even if they're traumatic or less than ideal events, rather than just some random chaotic thing that's happening to them, which means they see these events as manageable and their stressors are manageable and they find meaningfulness in them. So there's a lot of self-reflection that goes on. And that's where we can come in and sort of harness that natural or innate ability to self-reflect and really say, here's how we're going to guide that into goal setting. So professionalism, as I mentioned, is not an inherited trait. And it's the one thing that when we give proper feedback on it, it tends to encompass a whole bunch of other things, like the time and effort that goes into our work. And I love the quote, how you do anything is how you do everything. And I think that is so true of many of us as professionals. And I also wanted to state that professional identity formation is something we talk about as being teachable, yes, but it's something that is really learned over so long and so many experiences. And you really need, the life lived to have formed your professional identity in your work. And being a professional means taking into consideration the extent of a learner's experience as well. And so we as professionals have to look at who we're providing feedback to, who we're teaching, and say, okay, I recognize where you're at. I'm going to meet you where you're at, and we're going to go from there. It's easy enough to sort of lapse into this mindset of, well, I can do it, why can't you? Or, we should just have these expectations without having taught the expectation. So I want to try to veer away from that a little bit. So what might require feedback? Well, these are some domains of professionalism in the pharmacy education, and they include things like reliability, responsibility, accountability, lifelong learning, the ability to adapt. One of the things I think anybody that's been in their career for more than a hot minute can see is, your career doesn't always go the way you set out for it to go, and things change and technologies come up and policies change. And, so our adaptability is key. Our relationships with others are key in our professional identity formation, as are upholding principles of integrity and respect, which means we're teaching principles of integrity and respect. And then finally, being a citizen of the environment you're in and engaging in that professional environment. And so these all lead into our ability to identify as a particular professional. And lapses in professionalism are inevitable. I'm sure we've all had a lapse in professionalism before. We've witnessed a lapse in professionalism before. And so it really is imperative to normalize these lapses in our learners, assuming they're not occurring, all that frequently. And they may be occurring with reason. It may not be something we consider to be good reason, but the reason is still there, and we have to keep that in mind. So let's get into the reason why we're here today, and that's to talk about 3 different frameworks for providing feedback. There are more than 3. These are just 3 that I really like. They speak to me as a medical professional. And the first is SOAPing professionalism. And so when we SOAP professionalism, we apply this subjective, objective assessment and plan format to how we're going to provide feedback to the learner. And so we start by saying, okay, how are we responding to the situation? And what are our thoughts regarding the professional lapse that have occurred? So we start by taking a survey of ourselves. How am I reacting? And if I am reacting in anger or I'm reacting in frustration, then we need to take a pause, and we're not going to deal with the feedback at that time. So this is really taking an objective inventory of what's going through my head as this occurs. Next, we're going to the objective, and that's where we're determining which behaviors we did observe and how they associate with the situation. And we can even go so far as to go a step back and say, well, which of these domains does that behavior fall under? And that can help guide some of that discussion as well. So it's one thing just to say you were unprofessional, but it's different to say, I want to talk about your relationships with others or, upholding principles of integrity and respect. Then we get into our assessment, and this is where we assess a differential diagnosis for the situation, the lapse, and the readiness for change. And so this is where we really need to be conscious of our own biases and the lens that we see the professional role through. I may see if somebody's presenting on a patient and they're not providing eye contact with me, maybe I'm thinking, well, you're having really poor eye contact right now, and that's not professional. But maybe there's a level of social discomfort that I have not accounted for. Maybe there's a visual impairment I have not accounted for. So we really have to step back and create a differential diagnosis as to what could be going on and not just assume the student or the learner was, out to be, harmful or do this intentionally. And then finally, we go into plan, and that's where we identify a stepwise approach to the next steps. Stepwise is key. Giving all of our feedback at once is not going to be effective. And so we can start by saying, all right, once we've gone through the S, the O, and the A, now we're at plan. First, let's try this. Let's see how that works. And then you give it a chance, and then you reevaluate. Okay, good. That worked. Now let's add this on. And you're going to give it some time, and you're going to reevaluate. Great, now let's layer this on. So this is very much a stepwise process that gets revisited over time. And so for the sake of time, I was hoping this could be a little bit more interactive, but I think just because we have such a brief amount of time to go through this content, I want you to think about a time you've had or witnessed a lapse in professionalism in somebody you were precepting. And just keep that situation in your head as we go through these 3 frameworks. So when we take that situation and we start to apply, we start with the subjective. You might ask yourself, what is it in particular that's bothering me about the situation? And how does my background, my knowledge, my identity, strengths, weaknesses influence this? I am somebody who is like very checklist oriented. I like to get things done. I like to take action. I feel good when things are behind me. If I'm working with somebody who doesn't work in that same, checklist manner, I can get frustrated. But I have to stop and go, well, they are not me. And not everybody is going to approach a project the same way I am. So then moving into the objective, ask yourself, is this an isolated incident or is this a pattern of events? And that's going to steer the conversation. It's important not to make assumptions regarding your observations. And sometimes it's important to ask yourself, am I viewing this correctly, or should I run this by another person before I approach the person I want to provide feedback to? So then we get into that assessment, and I would recommend having at least 3 differentials prior to having the conversation with your learner, and going into it going, all right, it was a poor journal club. Was it imposter syndrome? Was it unpreparedness? Or was it a stressful event at home? So I come in with at least 3 differentials. And then finally, the plan, again, we're going to agree on concrete, doable, stepwise based next steps. So another framework that we can use when we plan on how to provide feedback to students is through what's called GROWS coaching. And I love this model because it takes on the coach model as the preceptor. And with it, you can see the acronym spells out GROWS, but it's goals, reality, options, way forward, and success. So we first start by establishing a shared goal between the learner and the preceptor. And again, going back to previous slides, we often have to teach our learner how to goal set and what is an appropriate goal and how do you monitor success towards that goal. And then we look at the reality. We're going to identify current situation and barriers to our goals, and then what we have at our fingertips to provide help, right? What are the strengths, resources available? And so this section is asking the question, where are we currently in relation to where we want to be? Then we're going to go to our options. We're going to weigh all of them. We're going to weigh all of our options and strategies, and we're going to find several. So this is very much in line with the previous framework where we're coming in with 3 differentials prior to a conversation. We're going to determine a way forward to choose the best next step and determine the path to implementation. And again, very similar to the first framework, we're choosing a best next step. We're not giving all the steps at once. And then finally, we follow up and reevaluate with very specific and very intentional follow-up. And I will just mention here, one of the questions or comments I hear when I talk about this topic is, I don't have time to give this much feedback. And my response to that is, if you don't have time to give proper feedback, you really don't have time to give the assessment. And so this is something that is inherently or should inherently be included in anything you're assigning to your students and your learners. So again, holding that same scenario in mind, or maybe you've thought of a different scenario, start with an open-ended question. How did you feel about the situation that just occurred? Get some of that insight from the person you're talking to. And then assess the insight. Can you tell me more about that? Really start to dig into what they're saying to you. And then ask what might be good next steps for your learner. How can I best support you? What resources do you need? Did I give you enough instruction? Are you feeling okay? And then finally, how can we approach this differently in the future? Because without change, this change is what you need to see in this model, right? And so the final framework for today is called 19 words. And I love this. These are the 19 words right here on this slide. They say, I'm giving you these comments because I have very high expectations and I know that you can reach them. I've counted, there are 19 there. And these words, this quote is not the feedback, but this is a signal that creates a powerful connection to the student, to the resident, to the learner. And so if you start with something along this line as you're providing feedback, and oftentimes difficult feedback, you're signaling to your learner, you are a part of this group. This is a special group that holds high standards, and I believe in your ability to reach those standards. And the key to making or having or providing good feedback is making a connection in the relationship with that person, which is why I started at the beginning of this talk by saying we need to recognize who these learners are and what they need from us. And so this helps us do three things. It helps us connect. This again sort of calls back a quote. They can't care about how much you know until they know about how much you care. You could have all the best ideas in the world, but if they're not getting the sense that you care, they're not going to listen. You want to then highlight the group. So what does it mean to belong to this pharmacy, this institution, this medical team, Western New England University? We have high standards, and you're here because we have all the faith that you can reach those standards. And again, that calls back to the growth mindset. And then finally, we don't want to de-emphasize task difficulty. We really want to emphasize what you're doing is hard. I recognize that. That's why you're in your appies. That's why you're on residency. But you're here because you have what it takes. And you've been through a rigorous program that got you to this point. And so again, maybe you have that scenario in mind. You can start with these 19 words or something like that. But the ultimate message you're providing with whatever follows, and I would say at this point, think back to your other two frameworks. We're a team, I care, and we're going to work together to help you accomplish this difficult task. Now, to wrap up, let's assume as I conclude my presentation, imagine you're about to tell me this. Imagine I'm about to open it up for questions and comments, and somebody says, Kim, I really didn't think that presentation went well. What about you? What is going to happen in that moment to me? Well, all of a sudden you've set me up for a very uncomfortable conversation, right? And it's a vague statement. I might get very defensible. It's really not actionable. Well, what do you think went well? What do you think didn't go well? What do you think I can do better? So you can see why if we're not approaching difficult feedback with an intentional framework or an intentional approach, we're going to get into a cycle that we want to avoid. And that cycle is we have a natural tendency to downplay the feedback. Well, I don't think it was that bad. I just think there are a few things you can work on. When in your head, you're thinking, no, that was terrible, right? You're going to get into this cycle of downplaying, defensibility, nothing concrete, and then nothing really changes. And so in the end, the feedback really doesn't do anything, right? And that's not what we want. We instinctively also, as human beings, have a tendency to think that just because we have good ideas, we give good feedback. And good feedback has no bearing on the quality of our ideas, okay? It fails to account, thinking that and being trapped in that mindset fails to account for all the things we've talked about in this presentation. And so I will end with the fact that if you said this to me, I really didn't think your presentation went well. My gut reaction might be something like this. Ooh, ah, whoa, right? But we can take those three words and we can turn them around. And I will leave you with one last thing, and that's about how to institute a culture of ongoing feedback. Now, I will admit these are three safe words. You can find them in the literature. I do think this is a little bit beyond something that even I'm comfortable with. So you have to be a person that's comfortable with this. But you can say these are our three safe words when we're in discussion, when we're in patient care. If I say, oops, I'm signaling to you a mistake was made. I'm not going to be mean about it. I'm not going to jump all over you. I'm just going to say, oops, and let's regroup. If you're giving me something incorrect in conversation, I might say, ouch, right? Or if I say, whoa, maybe you didn't prepare well. And we can build this into our natural conversation over a rotation just to say, look, these are three little signals. Nobody has to get lost in the messaging. Let's just stop for a moment and just regroup. These encourage self-reflection, provide safe and inclusive environments. See, I tried to make a joke, but everybody's just like, no, you made a typo. I wrote normalize mistakes, but that's meant to be there. We can enhance connections, we can resolve conflict, promote understanding, and it helps us communicate effectively. But really, it helps us cultivate a safe and inclusive space. So my final thoughts, you have to have compassion for your learner. I think that's first and foremost. Remember who they are, and who they are might be different from who you are. Be explicit and concrete. You have to find the time and the space for the conversation. And so the importance, there is an importance, a massive importance to high quality verbal and written feedback. We haven't talked about this, but if it's one thing to say it to a person who's receiving it, it's another thing to get it on paper. So I would encourage you to do both. The benefit of writing it down is you're documenting it. Documentation is key. So is timing. If you're not happy, if you're in a bad mood, if you're angry about giving the feedback, this person just made a fool of me. We're not going to give feedback in that moment. We're going to step back and collect ourselves. And maybe we'll schedule time. It doesn't have to happen as a knee-jerk reaction to an issue unless there's something urgent about the scenario. Openness to feedback is associated with having that sufficient time, knowledge, and skills for the situation. We can consider routine performance metrics as well that are integrated in our daily tasks that can enhance future feedback quality. So for example, we can have a checklist every day of, okay, did you meet this? Did you meet this? Did you meet this? We can even go back to that, oops, ouch, whoa, and just build that into our conversation. So feedback doesn't have to be this big daunting thing. It can be these little steps you take daily. And then finally, you may even consider, if your feedback is not getting through to a person, maybe doing some video review. Like, I want you to watch yourself when you're doing this, and let's talk through this together. And sometimes that puts a little bit of a different lens on the situation. But that is what I have on effective feedback, and I am open to any questions or any discussion stories you want to share.
Well, Kim, thank you so much for providing us with this information and taking time out of your day to talk to all of us. We will make this available via a link that you can listen to it again or share with your coworkers. And we will provide Kim's email address in case you have questions or want to reach out about more information. We really, really appreciate your time, Kim, and we want to thank you, everyone who joined us today for our Lunch and Learn. Our next Lunch and Learn next month will be on diversity, equity, inclusion in pharmacy practice, enhancing patient-centered care with Dr. Erin Whitman. So we look forward to hearing from all of you and seeing you next month.
Thank you so much, Heather and Experiential team, and to all those who attended. I appreciate it. Take care.